Good afternoon and welcome to SBAM Small Business Briefing. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications, and I'm joined today by our guest co-host, Kelly Saunders.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sarah. Kelly Saunders, Vice President of Policy and Engagement here at SBM, filling in for Brian Calley today, who's actually sitting on a focus group representing the small business voice. So we're happy to kind of relieve him from this duty, and I am excited to be here with you because we have lots of news to report on.
We do. And before we get into the news, I do want to make a quick welcome to one of our new members. It's NEG3 Consulting Services located in Dryden. All right, so Kelly, we should probably jump into the biggest news story, and that's the one that came out yesterday when President Biden announced that he will not be seeking re-election. So, what happened?
Yes, and I'm sure that many of you who were outside enjoying the day, it was a beautiful Pure Michigan weekend. If you came back inside and turned on the TV, it really did dominate most of the airwaves for the remainder of the day. It's not been a secret that really since the debate a few weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago now, there'd been some mounting pressure on whether President Biden should continue his reelection efforts. And I mean, by all means, his campaign and him stayed on message that they were in it for the long haul, that he was going to run for reelection, that they were confident that they were going to win. And so much to the point that really yesterday morning on news shows, all across networks, his internal team was saying that he is going to continue on. He had been sidelined last week a little bit because he had contracted COVID again and was not feeling well, had gone to Delaware to get some rest. And so, with the announcement, it was done in a letter form from him, touting a lot of the accomplishments of their administration, that he felt like he was really proud of those accomplishments, but it was time for him to step aside and essentially pass the torch to the next generation of leadership. Nowhere in the letter did he mention that he was going to endorse someone, which I know we're going to talk about next, Sarah. But it was really staying true to him making a decision for himself that he was not seeking that reelection effort, but no video of the president explaining that. With such a big announcement, that really did catch people off guard. But again, being sick with COVID, there was, some people that were saying that he, he had a cough, he was feeling very hoarse. And so putting him in front of a camera when he's not feeling well probably was not deemed to be the best use of his time in this seeking to get better. And so that was how the announcement was made yesterday. We did not see the president, just a letter touting accomplishments and that he would be stepping aside.
Yes, I think everybody was a little surprised that it was a letter and not a video. I do think we'll expect to hear from him directly later this week. But right, that first letter did not indicate any sort of endorsement, but really moments later, a second post was up and he did issue an endorsement. So talk a little bit about that.
Yes, again, kind of an unusual move saying, there were a bunch of people in the media saying, why did he not just make his endorsement of his, Vice President Kamala Harris at the same time? And I think, many people, and I believe this too, him thinking about his legacy and stepping aside, making that letter about, him and his choice to do this. The second announcement came out quite quickly after, maybe like within the half hour, I think, that said, I wholeheartedly endorse my Vice President Kamala Harris for president. And so that came out quickly after. Again, a little bit, of an unusual move, maybe, but also him making the decision not to run and feeling really immense pressure from his party and from the very high up of leadership. There's talk about, former President Obama putting pressure on, Nancy Pelosi and all the other leadership, just really feeling like he needed to step aside because there were numerous factors that were not showing that the Democrats were faring well up and down the ticket with him staying on. And so I'm sure for him and his very inner circle that made this very difficult decision, it was going to be on his terms. And so that's kind of what we see maybe in this, breakup of an announcement, if you will, that he would, make this announcement himself and then turn to endorse his vice president.
Yes, definitely could stand alone as two separate, pieces of communication. All right, so Kelly, what happens now? The Democratic, convention is coming up next month. But how does this work? How does Vice President Harris secure the delegates and secure the nomination?
It's a great question, Sarah. And let me tell you, I, in the last 24 hours, have given myself an education on how convention politics work when you're a front runner that is essentially secured the delegates through the primary process. How does that work? Now, I'm sure you've read a lot about this in the last coming weeks with, pontificating if President Biden would not seek reelection at the end of the day. And truly, the convention is technically an open primary. While those delegates were promised to him, they're not automatically promised to Vice President Harris. And so, what you saw yesterday was, this term, she's been on the phones or working the phones. And it's because she has to essentially secure those delegates herself. Now, in the primary, when those delegates are promised to you, the convention essentially seals the deal, right? You go to the convention, there's all the pomp and circumstance. We'll talk about the Republican convention in a few minutes here, but they have to come and certify those results, nominating their candidate to be on the ballot, essentially. And so Vice President Harris has been calling those delegates that were, essentially beholden to President Biden and getting them to pledge their support for her. She has to essentially get just shy of 2,000 delegates to support her. This morning, when I was, getting ready, and I haven't had time to look at those counts before the small business briefing, was that she was already at 531 or 71 this morning. And so that, there's numerous ways that delegates are elected at their local conventions, but also you've got this idea of like super delegates that are elected officials from all around the country that she can call and shore up to. And that's why you saw that, list start to come out quite quickly yesterday when President Biden endorsed her with all these elected officials lining up behind her. She needs all those people to come to the convention to support her. And so while there's this idea of about an open convention and other people coming in, and she's really, less than 24 hours at 571, I'm sure it's larger now. I feel like she's going to shore up those delegates in order to be the nominee for the Democratic Party. And so that's really what her task has been since this announcement has come on. We've also seen in the news today a big fundraising haul within less than 24 hours, somewhere in the 52 million. I'm sure it's higher now, because people had questions about even money that was in the Biden Harris camp, essentially a joint account that they essentially have. So obviously that was meant for him. If she secures the nomination because she's a part of that committee that holds those funds, she can access it. If they choose another candidate, their name is not on all those funds that President Biden and Vice President Harris raised. So they would not be able to access those funds in a direct way. They could make independent expenditures on another candidate's behalf, but she really is the one that has access to existing funds and is clearly unlocking funds that we're waiting to see what would happen as President Biden made his decision to either stay in or step aside. So we will be watching. As you said, Sarah, the Democratic Convention is August 19th through the 22nd in Chicago. And so lots of things at play as we approach this August convention for the Democrats.
Definitely. Let's end the segment with talking about President Biden, and what happens between now and the end of his term in January.
Sure. So he was very clear I can't remember I believe it was another statement that his intention is to finish his term. And so that means remaining president until the next president is sworn in January. Now, there's been sometimes people, they can't help themselves. And I'm not saying one way is right or wrong, but there was this question of, if he cannot run for reelection, is he fit enough to finish his term out? And so there's been this call for the 25th Amendment for him to essentially step aside before his term is finished in January of next year. There's no indication that that is his intent. The statement was pretty clear that he is stepping aside to not run for reelection so he can focus on his presidential duties. And so what I think that what we would see is for him to finish out his term through obviously the end of the year into January, and then be finished at that time. But again, time will tell. As we saw yesterday morning, it seemed like their campaign was posturing that he wasn't stepping aside, and then all of a sudden he was. But we really do wish him good health. Obviously, with COVID and not being well, we hope that he is getting better. And so we'll see what happens in that too. But by all measures, it looks like he will finish his term until the next president is elected.
All right, let's continue talking about presidential politics. Former President Trump was in Michigan this weekend following the Republican National Convention that was last week in Milwaukee. So tell us a little bit more about his visit here, and then do you have some highlights from the convention?
Yes. So I think Brian might have gone over that the convention was starting last week. They were in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, obviously a battleground state for Democrats and Republicans. By all means, it looked to be a very smooth convention. The Republican Party seems pretty unified. And why I say that is because I think every single candidate, almost every, if not, that ran against President Trump, former President Trump, in the primary had speaking time on the stage in Milwaukee and gave their wholehearted endorsement of former President Trump as we move towards November. And so it's really hard to get people to kind of put their beef aside and come and do so. Some notables, obviously, that hung there in the longest, former Governor Nikki Haley, who her speech was really aimed at those people that really are in the moderate space of the Republican Party, even lean independent, saying that Republicans have to come together if they're going to win. Governor DeSantis from Florida, obviously very heated back and forth between him and former President Trump during that primary, again, speaking in support. And so it was obviously an interesting convention, given former President Trump's line of work prior to running for president in, showbiz, had some, very high profile actors, actresses, people from wrestling coming and speaking, and then musical performances by big time people. So it looked like a very well organized convention. And so again, another pressure, I'll say, probably on the Democrats to have the same type of presentation, because this one is really shaping up, obviously, to be a doozy with President Biden stepping aside. But whether you agree with Republican policies and politics overall, I even think from left-leaning commentators said it was very well run, and it sounds like Milwaukee was welcoming and did a great job by hosting this convention. And so yes, former President Trump, did make his first rally stop to be in Michigan, in Grand Rapids, on Saturday, with his new VP choice, JD Vance, out of Ohio. He's a senator there. And so they did fill the Van Andel Arena in Grand Rapids with 12,000 people. It was very well attended. It's not uncharacteristic for former President Trump to make a stop in Michigan after some of these very pivotal moments in a campaign cycle. He's done it often in Michigan. And so as they seek to play in these battleground states, like we've been saying all along, Michigan is in play. Michigan is important to candidates from both parties. The Republicans definitely are showing that, and I will continue to see that from Democrats as well. And so definitely filled it on the west side. He was obviously speaking to his running mate and how they feel like they have a solid ticket. There's this whole coalescence around unity and making sure that they're all on the same page. And that's really what was delivered, outside of obviously jabs to the other side, which we are going to continue to see leading up to November. And so that's the report on that side of presidential politics. But I do, Sarah, if you don't mind, want to touch on a poll that came out. And it was very telling. This is pre President Biden deciding to not run for reelection. The Detroit Free Press, basically, I believe on Sunday, before President Biden dropped out, released a poll that they had done, Epic MRA, 600 people, I believe, more of a left-leaning pollster, that former President Trump was leading President Biden 49 to 42%. It was a 7-point lead, which had doubled from the last time they had done one. And so President Biden had said, I'm not going to back out of this race unless I really see polling that is putting me behind and not in a place where I want it. And this was not the only poll in a battleground state that was starting to show that. And so I'm not saying that this poll played a role in his decision making, but it's starting to show when he was at the top of the ticket that there were eroding numbers that were shifting the other way in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, that were starting to show that there was not a road for success with him being the candidate of the Democrat Party. And so it's pretty notable to say that Michigan, also with former President Trump, he was leading across all regions of Michigan. That includes the Detroit metro area, Oakland, Wayne, Macomb, in West Michigan, in Northern Michigan, every single place right now in this poll, former President Trump was winning. And so that's got to be telling, specifically out of our Southeast Michigan region, that this was kind of starting to go sideways for them. And so that's kind of where we land today. If you are interested in that poll, make sure you check out the Detroit Free Press and read more into it. But we continue to play a role in these very pivotal times.
Yes, we do. Let's talk about the US Senate race here in Michigan, specifically on the Republican side. There was an announcement over the weekend. What happened?
Yes, so at that Grand Rapids rally, the U.S. Senate race on the Republican side, Sandy Pensler from Southeast Michigan announced that he would be backing out of the race and he was endorsing Mike Rogers, who is the perceived frontrunner in that race. The reason why this is notable is Sandy Pensler was basically a self-funded candidate. He had invested, I think, $4 million into his campaign, and really had targeted in on Mike Rogers not being totally loyal to the Trump movement the whole time, and that he was. And so with Trump's message around unity, I'm sure that probably resonated with him, and that's the reason that he chose to get out. Also, not really seeing a path necessarily as we lean into this primary in August. And so he decided to forego his bid for Senate and get behind Mike Rogers. There are two other people that are still in the race on the Republican side, Justin Amash and Sherry O'Donnell. Again, I'm guessing that Mike Rogers is coming out of that primary, but I'll flip the coin here. And remember, on the Democrat side, we have this race between Alyssa Slotkin and Hill Harper. Again, Alyssa Slotkin perceived to come out of that primary for this Rogers-Slotkin matchup. But going back to the polling I just talked about, there was a poll that was done again by the Detroit Free Press that had Alyssa Slotkin up over Mike Rogers, 43 to 40%, with 17% undecided. So in that race, kind of a flip where we've seen kind of a Republican upswing, if you will, not necessarily in this race, but he's within the margin of error. And so watching that race is going to be really interesting as well as we get closer to November. And again, some people believe in polls and some people don't, but it's our job to inform you. So that is the news out of the U.S. Senate race. But I'm going to stop talking, Sarah, and you have something to talk about that's not political and something we know to be true. So Gallup did a poll, and who is the most trusted voice in America?
Right, here we are talking about more polls. And so we're going to just go ahead and trust this poll, implicitly. But yes, Gallup released some new polling results that were very favorable to small businesses. In fact, the 1,000 voters that they polled in June, of those 1,000 voters, 68% said that they trust small businesses. And that was the top spot for all the trusted or all the institutions that they polled on. Only two other institutions earned a majority confidence, police at 51% and military at 61%. So I don't think this is very surprising. Small businesses are the cornerstones of our communities. And I think it underscores why it's critical to foster a pro-small business environment. And we did mention that this poll was of voters, but the faith in small business, it did transcend political lines. Democrats measured at a 69% confidence rate, independents at 68%, and Republicans at 70%. So again, small businesses' most trusted institution in America right now. I'm going to share a link here in a minute, and it'll show you a statement that Brian issued about the results, and then it'll link to that Gallup poll as well so that you can view the complete results there. But before I do that, Kelly, I want to ask you about a new office that Governor Whitmer created, and this stems from the Growing Michigan Together Council. What can you tell us?
Yes. So, if you recall, Brian served on the Growing Michigan Together Council, and that was really seeking to address our population issues here in Michigan. And essentially, what the governor is doing is streamlining that work into a new office called the Michigan Growth Office. And so, if you recall, there were a few staff members that were hired on to do this council work, and then now are tasked with taking the council's recommendations and putting them into practice, whether that's through state government entities or maybe working through the budget process. And so, the headlines surrounding this was that the governor was streamlining some governmental services by sunsetting that council because their work is completed. That's not abnormal for a governor to do so, but to create this office within the Michigan Economic Development Corporation to continue the work of what the council had set out in their report. And that's working in conjunction with the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity too, because they're so tightly aligned on workforce and then obviously economic development as a whole. So I will say, for your tax dollars, they are not hiring any new people. They are essentially taking those 4 people, keeping them on the state government payroll to do this work. Just a reminder, how important this work is, Brian's talked about before, population has been a huge problem as we've grown over the last, we'll say 5 years, because we have an older population and they're retiring, and so we don't have a workforce necessarily to replace them. Well, we have to continue to take care of our small business owners and our companies here at home. We also have to, start thinking about attraction issues. And so we are still the 10th most populous state in the nation. We are a big state, 10 million strong. And so having, resources, but also strategies and how to, again, take care of our companies that are already here and our workforce that is already here, and then figuring out how do we attract populations here that want to call Michigan home. That's what this office and these people will be tasked with. And so we'll look forward to working with them. We're very interested in this work. We always have been, and we'll continue to keep you updated. There are some allocations that were made in this budget the last time around, regarding innovation, talent attraction, that they will be working on, and then also working with MyLeap on some education reform issues, which we're all integrated into as well here at SBAM. So just highlighting the news that Brian's work in this space continues, and we'll look forward to making sure that people find value in calling Michigan home.
All right, let's talk about electric vehicles again. The big three
Yeah.
is in the news. We've talked on this show a lot about electrification and fuel efficiencies, but what's the latest, Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, this is just one of those I told you so stories, unfortunately. So, we obviously love the big three, very important part of our economy, but Stellantis, in the news for not great things. They had to pay a fine, in May for 112.3 million. They had already paid 78.4 million in March. And then they still have one that's outstanding for 459.7 million. And this is all because vehicle fuel standard efficiencies have not been met. And again, to some point, people are choosing to not buy electric vehicles and they are choosing to buy fuel powered vehicles. And so we know that federal guidelines have become more stringent over time. It was a focus of the Biden Harris administration to really push people towards electric vehicles. It's been a push here in Michigan. We've talked about the energy legislation in depth, but the market continues to show us is that consumers are not in it to win it on the EVs. And it could be for numerous things. It could be because of cost. It could be because of preference. And so I think even the big three, what they are saying is it's not that we're not committed to moving that direction. What we're hearing from consumers is they're not there yet. And so while, you know, our our auto industry essentially tries to figure this out alongside fuel efficiencies, but cost. And we know that cost of living is so high right now. Like that is the number one thing that people are saying is my cost of living is too high. I cannot afford things. That's what's being replicated in these fines on fuel efficiencies that are not being met. To note, GM has had fines as well because they've not met fuel efficiency standards. We obviously heard them kind of back off their very aggressive approach to go to all EVs. I think within the next 10 years they were at. And so again, just one of those things of an I told you so a little bit that our people are just not, they're not there. And so you have to sometimes let the market drive, no pun intended.
All right, let's end on kind of a fun story about a new Hall of Fame induction from the weekend.
So I'm a big sports fan, and when the Tigers were in all their glory going to the World Series in 2012, like that was the best time ever. And this past weekend, our former manager of the Detroit Tigers, Jim Leland, was inducted into the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. And so it's a nice thing to highlight our various sports here in Michigan. And we get excited, obviously, last season about the Lions doing so well. But it was a nice memory to think back on the time when the Tigers were AL Central champs and to see our former manager get a very deserved place in the Hall of Fame was exciting this weekend. So on to end this briefing, I'll say go Tigers, and maybe one day we'll get back there again.
All right, yeah, go Tigers. And it unlocked a memory of mine from, oh gosh, probably more than 30 years ago now of visiting Cooperstown, New York and the Hall
Oh,
of Fame.
fun.
So it's a really cool place.
Well, I'll aspire to that. I have not been there, but it is definitely on the list.
Add it to your list. All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in today. We will be back here next Monday at 3 p.m. Have a great rest of your week.
Have a good week, everybody.